Peter, I'd like to begin with you tonight. We just learned of an interview the president has given to two journalists with the Washington Examiner. I'll read you this. This is over a phone call that is a good call. Trump, sitting behind the Resolute desk, said, "At some point, I'm going to sit down, perhaps as a fireside chat on live television, and I will read the transcript of the call because people have to hear it. When you read it, it's a straight call." Peter, couple notes here. We haven't seen or heard yet the transcript of the call. We have seen a summary of the call. So that much, I suppose, would be news. What do you make of this?
Well, look, I think it's actually, goes to his theatrical entertainment style of the presidency, right? His idea is that he can put on a performance and therefore convince the public, or at least a significant portion of the public, they did nothing wrong. He has said from the beginning he thinks that the phone call was perfect, such as it was, that he didn't, do anything that improperly pressured a foreign country for his own political benefit. I think, obviously, a lot of people have read that transcript, or rough transcript, or incomplete transcript, or however we want to frame it, and come to a different conclusion. Now, if he did that on a television thing, obviously it's a way of daring the other side to say, oh, see what's wrong with this, and trying to explain it to the public, a public that may or may not be paying much attention, that may or may not, get into the nuances of the phone call or the nuances of the testimony that surrounds the call. It's not just the call, it's the context in which the call took place, which is to say, while Rudy Giuliani is putting pressure on the Ukrainians, while, the Ukrainians have been told they get no meeting with the White House unless they produce the statements that the president wants about investigation of Democrats, while security aid has been temporarily suspended at the very same time the president makes the call. So all these things add up. It's not just the call, but it would be a showman's way of approaching it, and it would be a kind of daring way of challenging the Democrats to make their case.
Peter, because you've been doing this for a while and because you and I covered the Clinton era, widen out here. How consequential a day was this in our modern history?
Well, it's a big day. Anytime the House of Representatives votes to launch an impeachment inquiry or to set the frame of a debate for an impeachment inquiry, that's a big thing. We've only seen it a handful of times in the country. Now we've seen it 3 times in the last 40 years with Nixon and Clinton. I think it was in some ways a bad day for the president in the sense that if he hoped to divide the Democrats into scaring some of those Democrats who were from swing districts where Trump won in 2016 and voting against it, didn't work. For the most part, the Democrats stuck together. It was a pretty unified caucus. I think it was a good day for the president in the sense that the Republicans also stuck by him. And then, in fact, not a single Republican went along with this idea of an inquiry. And it's a lot easier to vote for an inquiry if you're a Republican than to vote for an actual impeachment article, if that's what it comes to in several weeks' time. So I think that, in effect, he set the standard for which it's going to be harder for Republicans to switch sides. So that's a good thing for him if it stays partisan, because it means he will, have a better chance of winning acquittal in the Senate. It does, though, suggest that there's likely to be a party line vote in the House in the near future.
So, Andy Carney, help us turn the corner. Does anything at the White House change by dint of what we witnessed today? Is this a pivot point? Are there more people being added? Or are we going to see a new response?
They've been talking about adding a few new communications aides now for a little while, so we may still see that. But one thing that I heard today from Republican lawmakers who have been speaking to the president over the past 2 weeks is that his tone and mood on this sort of changed once he realized that no Republicans in the House were going to break with him on this vote. They said behind closed doors, he has been consistently bringing up this subject that why aren't you guys defending me on substance? Why is it only on process? I want a defense for me that's also based on the substance of my interactions on this call and with the Ukrainians. There was nothing wrong with that ever. And expressing frustration, I talked to someone who spoke with him yesterday who said that he was mostly talking about baseball and seemed relieved now that he knew that all the Republicans were going to be on his side in this. So his mood seems to be better than it has been now that he sees that it's really breaking completely along party lines, and that but a big question for them will be, now that this impeachment probe is entering a new phase, a public phase, what will be their argument if they can't knock the process, that it's going on behind closed doors? It's not going to be behind closed doors anymore. What's the argument of why this process is flawed? That's a question they're going to have to answer.
Okay, Jeremy Bash, however much this might be a buzzkill for the president, let's both listen to Adam Schiff tonight. We'll talk about it on the other side.
One of the aspects of the resolution that we passed today authorizes me to begin releasing transcripts, and I would expect that process will begin as early as next week. You will see extensive periods of questioning by the staff counsel, both majority and minority. That's the practice we've used in the depositions. It's been very effective to bring out the facts. It's very conducive, I think, to telling the narrative of what happened.
So, Jeremy Bash, this is going to hurt the process argument. The Republicans today who said this was Soviet style, this investigation thus far, because it's all going to come out. There are a number of Republicans who want to say to this president, don't argue this as a fireside chat because the facts aren't good for you either.
Yeah, I think when these transcripts are released, it's going to be a worse picture for the president. All of the witnesses who have come forward have essentially corroborated the same story, that there was an effort by the president to ask the Ukrainians to interfere in the 2020 election, that he withheld American military aid and a White House visit until that happened, and that the White House staff, including lawyers of the White House staff, sought to cover that up. And so really the defenders of the president really have only three places to go without these process arguments available to them. Number one is, I guess perhaps they could say, well, the facts weren't as described. He never said these things, and it's a misinterpretation of the people who heard that. I don't think that's going to fly. They could argue the law. They could say, look, the president did do these things, but it's not unlawful, not impeachable. In other words, it's awful, but not unlawful. And I guess the third approach, and we've begun to see hints of this, is that they can just go on the attack against decorated combat veterans like Ambassador Bill Taylor, who was in the 101st Airborne in Vietnam and who has served a 25-year public service career culminating in his role as ambassador to Ukraine, or Colonel Vindman, who's an active duty Army officer who has served for 20 years in the military, was wounded in combat in Iraq, and is going to tell the story that he heard the phone call personally and he thought it was inappropriate and illegal.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.